And the schedule that the National Park Service tells me that I am supposed to tell you a story at 1 o'clock. And that's going to work well because I am in fact a storyteller.
Okay, bye-bye.
I hope you're enjoying your day here at the Civil War Interpretive Center. I hope that you have seen this morning already one of the cavalry demonstrations. There have also been artillery demonstrations and infantry. And the 1 o'clock talk is my turn. And I get to tell you the story about Old Douglas, the Confederate Camel. Now that's camel singular. And for those of you who are smarter than a fifth grader, you'll see that we have two camels out here, plural. So for the next few moments while I tell stories, I want you to ignore the other camel, pretend he's not here, and I want to try and take us back to October of 1862 when there was a singular camel here. He would have been a one-hump camel like this. His hump is right here underneath the saddle. And he was the animal mascot of the 43rd Mississippi Volunteer Infantry. History books call that regiment the Camel Brigade, or Sterling Price's Camel Brigade. And to the uninitiated, that might lead you to believe that there was an entire regiment mounted on camels. But we've already learned that there was a singular camel here, and an entire regiment could not fit on even the largest camel, and he is not the largest our family has. But that singular camel, I love his name, Old Douglas, was charged with a very, very important job working for the Mississippi 43rd Volunteer Infantry, and that was carrying the regimental band instruments. He was a roadie. And I love this story. So any ideas that you've got in your mind about a soldier mounted on camelback with a saber in one hand and a pistol in the other and the reins in his teeth charging into battle simply didn't happen here. And Corinth actually isn't the first place that Old Douglas appears on history's radar. We first learned of Old Douglas a little earlier in 1862, just due east of here at the Battle of Iuka. So that's the first time we hear about Old Douglas. We don't really know where Old Douglas came from or how Lieutenant William Hargrove came to be in possession of Old Douglas, the one-hump camel, but he was, and we're richer now from a historical perspective because these stories were told in the late 1800s by some Confederate veterans who were members of the 43rd Mississippi Volunteer Infantry. If those gentlemen hadn't told those stories and a journalist nearby hadn't heard them and written them down, we wouldn't know about this. Now, spoiler alert, Old Douglas did not change the course of war. The entire battle between the states was not hinged on a single camel. If you can imagine some of the larger engagements, Vicksburg, for example, tens of thousands of soldiers, that means tens of thousands of horses and mules, and in some cases private or citizen ox wagons, folks driving oxen. So thousands of animals here in the theater of Mississippi in war from fall of 1862 to early summer of 1863. Tens of thousands of animals, and we are going to predicate an entire lecture on one single animal, and that is a camel. And there's a reason we do this. The National Park Service, of course, is charged with the duty of preserving our history and telling these stories. And as technology changes and as times progress, the art of storytelling becomes more difficult and more difficult because really what we're up against is that modern technology. All right, it's so easy for a person to grab their phone and Google information or to play a game. So as a storyteller, as somebody who makes a living in living history, this is my competition. So how then do I try to hook you and get you into history? I don't mind telling you, I'm happy to be the dancing chicken. all right? I'll bring my camels out, and if there's one person, young or old, who might have had kind of a bad experience with history back in high school or college, and I hear it all the time, man, I didn't enjoy history at all, but I sure enjoyed your talk, then I've done a good job. And the others of us doing living history out here, from our cavalry boys, to our artillerymen or our infantrymen, we are all charged with taking this shared history that is yours, that is that young boy's, that is this gentleman's over here, that is this lady's right here. That is our history, and we should all be, I think, proud to share these stories. And we all do that. When you leave here and you read something in the museum, in the visitor center that kind of interested you, you go home and you share it. Hey, I read this and that was awfully interesting. That's how we keep these stories alive, and that is the #1 job of the National Park Service. Whether we're telling the story of the war between the states in the 1860s, or we're talking about Western exploration out west, the Grand Canyon, or any of our wonderful parks anywhere in the U.S. That is the primary goal of the National Park Service. So our story today is about Old Douglas, the camel. I've already mentioned William Hargrove, young lieutenant who is serving in Mississippi's 43rd Volunteer Infantry. Somehow he's got a camel. We first learned about him in Iuka, and then later in '62 here, October of '62. The reason for this event this weekend, of course, is to commemorate the 155th anniversary of the Battle of Corinth. Happened right here. Where we are sitting and or standing right now is the western approach that the Confederates took toward Battery Robinette, which is basically the visitor center and beyond. It's where the artillery are set up now. It should not go unnoticed, by the way, that there are over a dozen federal troops and there's only one Confederate troop, all right? The numbers clearly are not in my favor, but I'm going to spin it and I'm going to say they needed 16 because they're so afraid of me, all right? And I've got 2 camels. So there's no hidden agenda. There's no reason there's one lone Confederate here and a bunch of guys in blue. Most of the guys in blue are usually part of a Confederate group, but to man 4 guns, you've got to have 4 bodies on each gun to do it safely. So we have a whole lot of Federals because we have a whole lot of guns. 2 camels, 1 guy, I got this, no problem. So Old Douglas, for all time, up until very recently, was assumed to have come from a group of camels that was already operating in Texas. The federal government in 1856 imported 75 camels for use as pack animals out west. This is on the heels of the gold rush, all right? Gold had been discovered, but rail had not yet extended west. And as farm families heard about new land available or the possibility of discovering gold, folks wanted to move west. But in those days, without rail, and younger people without cars or airplanes or high-speed internet or any of these things we understand today, the only way that a family could move west would be on foot. You might be lucky enough to have a wagon that was pulled by horses or mules, but young, able-bodied, healthy folks were not in the back of that wagon. You only put what was absolutely necessary in that wagon to head west. That would probably be water, some clothing. Only young children like infants and maybe a grandma might be in that wagon, driven by an uncle or an older brother or a father. But most of us here, able-bodied, strong, would have walked, all right? So in these times following the gold rush, as there's a movement west, the federal government has to answer the question, how do we move people safely through that part of the U.S., which is desert? And horses, mules, donkeys, oxen, all suffering in the heat and the arid conditions. So the idea was hatched as early as 1836 to import camels into the U.S. to serve as pack animals, carrying water. And the way that worked in Texas, this is a slight departure from the story of Old Douglas, but it's always been assumed Old Douglas must have come from one of those camels. So the way those camels worked, they would be knelt down just like this, saddled just like this, and then you'd have a big wooden keg, you've all seen them, big wooden barrel filled with water, 30-gallon barrels. One would be rolled up to the left, one rolled up to the right, and then with ropes, 2 soldiers could lift them up, tie them to the saddle. Again, a pair of kegs, one on the left, one on the right. Camel's made to stand and he walks all day. they're carrying between 600 and 800 pounds. That fully eclipses by double the maximum regulation load that an Army mule would carry, which was 350 pounds. So it's a heck of a deal for the federal government. Again, this is 1856, pre-war, all right? Jefferson Davis in these days was simply a Mississippi senator, a Mexican-American war hero. By 1853, 1854, Davis is now Secretary of War. All right, others who have held that position would be through the Bush years, the second Bush years, Donald Rumsfeld would have held that position. Leon Panetta at a point. Today I forget who the Secretary of War is. But Jefferson Davis held that same position. And it was while Davis was Secretary of War that he convinced Congress to import camels. He'd actually gone to the Senate twice before, in 53 and 54, asking for camels, for this idea that some military men had suggested, moving folks out west, moving supplies. And in 53 and 54, he was laughed off the Senate floor. In 55, though, now Secretary of War, and he's got a little bit of help from a buddy of his, a war hero named Shields, who's a senator from Illinois. Senator Shields goes before Congress, and he's lobbying for roads and bridges in Illinois. And who's going to say no to that? Everybody needs roads and bridges. It passes with flying colors. But what Congress didn't really do was read the fine print. And along with roads and bridges in Illinois, Davis, for the third time approaching Congress, puts in fine print on the bottom, and $30,000 for camels. So things don't change, right? And that is, by the way, how you turn a camel into pork. So the camel appropriation is funded. $30,000, they send big ship over to the Middle East and North Africa. 75 camels are loaded, offloaded down on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Below Port Lavaca, in a town that's now a ghost town. It's called Indianola. And those camels worked for the next 5 years, from 1856 to 1861, again, pre-war, all right? So 1861, war breaks out. The Federal Army withdraws from Texas in February of 1861. The little 2nd Cavalry Post in the Texas Hill Country, where the camels were headquartered, is taken over then by Confederates, the guys in gray. And not only do they become the owners of a sack of flour or a keg of black powder or whatever assets might have been there at Camp Verde, Texas, the Confederate Army also finds itself in ownership of over 5 dozen camels that remained there at Camp Verde. Now for the war years, 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, those camels in Texas didn't work a lot. Again, no big battles in Texas requiring camels. So what the Confederate Army did with the camels during the war years was transport cotton, which the South has a lot of, between San Antonio and Brownsville, Texas, the southern tip of Texas. There was a port there, Port Brown, for which Brownsville is named, that had not been blockaded by the Union. So the South had trade through that port. And the South has cotton. The British wanted cotton. The British had salt. So the Confederacy traded cotton for salt out of Port Brown, and it gives rise to one of my favorite all-time alliterative phrases, and that is Confederate camel caravans carrying cotton in the 1860s. So cotton moving south, salt back north between San Antonio and Brownsville. Again, no big battles with camels except here in Mississippi. When you look at the scope of the war, those 4 years, and we have some big battles in those years. Gettysburg, horribly tragic. Antietam. Any of these are big hallmark battles. Mississippi has just as incredible, and in some ways even more unique, history. Mississippi is the only state that ever saw a single camel in battle. Now again, old Douglas is hauling band instruments. He wasn't actively involved in fighting, but the band serves a very, very important role in war, and that is to provide morale for the troops in camp. It's to lift up spirits. It's to create a cadence when marching. So the band was very important, and old Douglas hauling those band instruments had a very important job. So it's long been assumed old Douglas must have come out of that group of camels in Texas. Where else in the early 1860s would you have found a camel? Probably in those days, the only zoo we had in the U.S. was in Philadelphia. That seems unlikely to get a camel from there. So for the longest time, historians and researchers have just assumed, where else would you have gotten him from? But recent research shows that on the heels of the government importation of camels, just like with what happens anytime, the military pioneers technology, and then private business sees it and follows. All right, any of you who have a smartphone, that's military technology. The military develops this, and then private enterprise follows. So just like an iPhone, the camel became an object for commercial exploitation. The Federal Army imports the 75 into Texas, and then businessmen, enterprising folks see this. Seems like a good idea. We're already bringing in goats and sheep and horses and donkeys from the Mediterranean. There's camels there too, why not? So we find 3 commercial importations of camels, one in San Francisco, one in Galveston, and one in Mobile, Alabama. Now, I'm not a geography major, but when I look at the U.S. map, and I see Mobile down here on the Gulf, and I see Iuka right up here, Corinth and Vicksburg, with that proximity to Mobile, and I see San Antonio over here where the U.S. Army camels were, imported in the 1850s, I think it's a heck of a lot more likely that old Douglas came out of this commercial importation into Mobile in 1860. There's actually a newspaper ad listing these animals for sale in the Mobile Daily Register, March 23rd of 1860. Choice breeding stock for sale, pure Arabian horses, Spanish merino sheep, pure cashmere goats, Maltese and Spanish jacks, donkeys, Maltese goats using bucks, and here's my favorite, 30 superior young camels, well broke, suitable for any plantation work. So I propose that William Hargrove, who comes from a plantation family about 70 miles southeast of here, probably bought a camel or more and used them for work on their plantation. I don't know this, we don't have letters from Hargrove, but again, as I look at a map and I see Mobile here, here's Mississippi right next door, and there's San Antonio way over there, I think the most likely story of origin for old Douglas is that he came in out of that group of camels, and when Hargrove enlists, he brings old Douglas with him. And using an animal mascot in war is not unheard of. In the Civil War, there are plenty of dogs as regimental mascots, a bald eagle for another. So it's not that far of a stretch that old Douglas, the camel, would have become a mascot and a true burden bearer for the 43rd Mississippi. So he starts in Iuka, he comes here to Corinth in October of 1862. Then we don't hear much about him. The 43rd is still fighting, but Douglas again comes up on the radar in May of 1863. He's at Vicksburg. And for the next 40 days, Vicksburg is going to come under siege. On the western side, he's heard this story before. He's utterly bored with it. He also knows it doesn't end well for old Douglas. So he may already be kind of getting his sad face on. So the western approach to Vicksburg, the Mississippi River, is blockaded by the Federal Navy. Crazy rabbit trail. You ready for this? The admiral who is in charge of the Federal Navy on the Mississippi is a guy named David Porter. Porter was a Navy lieutenant 5-6 years earlier, and he was in charge of a ship called the USS Supply. The USS Supply is the ship that went to the Middle East to buy those original 75 camels. He couldn't have known, as he was sitting on the Mississippi shelling the hills there in Vicksburg. If you're not from Mississippi, yes, there are hills in Mississippi, all right? So Porter is shelling Vicksburg, probably completely unknown to him that there's a camel in there. Probably wouldn't have made any difference, right? It's war. But Porter has the Mississippi blockaded. The Federal Army has now got the approach from Jackson on the east and the north, the high road there in Vicksburg, completely blocked off. And the only direction that you can come into Vicksburg would be from the south. Very little information is coming in or going out. very few supplies, and before you know it, a federal group from Louisiana come in and they block the south side. Now Vicksburg in May, June, early July of 1863 is choked. No information coming in or out, no supplies coming in or out, and the Confederate troops at Vicksburg, including the 43rd Mississippi, with Old Douglas, are starting to become hungry. Those boys are eating parts of farm animals that your grandparents wouldn't have even eaten. They were eating domestic animals like dogs, cats. They'd already taken to eating the horses and mules. They were even boiling their leather shoes to eat those. Another thing they began eating was something called field pea loaves, and that is dried black-eyed peas, mashed up, mixed with water, baked into a loaf, and the outside looks beautiful. Looks like the most beautiful loaf of bread ever. Then when you bite into it, yeah, it's still mushy black-eyed pea, all right? As a living historian and storyteller, interpreter, we eat the kinds of things that soldiers ate in those days. And I can tell you, short of my shoes, all right, those field pea loaves are probably the nastiest thing I've ever eaten. So I can really feel some empathy for those soldiers. But late in June of 1863, a federal soldier takes aim there at Vicksburg and he shoots Old Douglas, and Old Douglas dies. And you can imagine that in these times, given what we've now learned about what the Confederate troops in Vicksburg were eating, forced to eat, they had probably already been looking at Old Douglas with a specific look for some time, right? A friend of mine says, are you sure that one of them Union boys actually shot that camel? But if you can appreciate that a full-grown camel, 7 feet tall, 12 to 1,400 pounds, is going to give you 600 to 700 pounds of meat, you can appreciate why the Confederates, the 43rd, went ahead and ate Old Douglas after what they'd been through. Now, to add insult to injury, 4th of July on, when the federal occupation of Vicksburg begins, Old Douglas is cut up and his bones are fashioned into camel bone jewelry and sold as souvenirs. Now, there's a lot of camel there and a lot of bones, but when you're still selling camel bone jewelry 3 years, 5 years, 6 years down, I'm thinking you had to run out of camel at some point. So I'm sure some of those enterprising Federals were finding goats and cows and anything they could, but nobody could argue that Old Douglas gave everything for the war, up to and including his meat and his bones. Now, if you go into the Confederate cemetery in Vicksburg today, there is a marker for Old Douglas, but he's not buried there. We understand he was eaten, he was carved up, but that's a modern nod to history that Sons of Confederate Veterans, a modern group, has put there, just in the middle of the Confederate graveyard there, to share the story of Old Douglas. If not for that, we might forget this story. If not for these veterans in the 1890s telling these stories, we might forget that history. Again, the war between the states did not hinge on Old Douglas. It didn't hinge on a singular event. But if we can use these stories to interest people, to get them to interact, to enjoy and appreciate the history that we have here, I'm happy to do that. I travel throughout the year with our family's camels. We've got 9 of them. How do I pick which 2 come? These 2 were closest to the gate. Right? His grandmother, who we lost just last summer, a year ago, was 30 years old. She got smart. When she'd see the trailer pull up, she'd go to the far end of the field. And she'd stand there just as still as she could. We used her up until almost the day she died. She lived to be 30. And that's pretty normal for camels. Occasionally you'll find a 40-year-old camel, but not often. Up into their 20s, they're starting to get pretty heavy. They've probably been worked. Their joints, have got a little bit of abuse to them, wear and tear. The real work on a camel is not carrying that weight. It's lifting that weight from this kneeling position. Of course, unlike a horse, which is, the back is right here, it's easy to load, or a mule, but when this camel stands up, his back is 7 feet in the air. Now, if I'm loading these wooden pigs that are going to weigh 300 plus pounds, I obviously can't pick them up to load them, so you have a camel kneel down. That's how the Army, and in fact all armies around the world for 5,000 years have used camels. Camel kneels down, you load your gear either in these pockets on the saddlebags or tied to the horns. Even still, you could ride. This is a combination saddle for packing and for riding. Although neither the Confederacy here with Old Douglas or the federal government prior to the war was using camels for riding. Had the Civil War not interrupted that experiment, we'll call it, out west, we very likely could have seen camel-mounted cavalry in the West. We were actually the last army on the planet to adopt this animal. The Parthians, the Scythians, the Romans, the Mongols, the Kazakhs, the Berbers, the Bedouin of the Middle East, all desert people who have been engaged in war have used the camel for 5,000 years. We were simply the last army on the planet to try this out. And I do believe, if not for the Civil War interrupting that experiment, we'll call it, we would have seen a much larger camel population in the U.S. Again, we had only 75 imported by the U.S. Army, another 200 imported commercially. So let's just round up and say 300 camels. That may sound like a lot of camels, but when you consider that in this county alone, you've probably got 3,000 cows, it's not a lot of camels. Today, our U.S. camel population is about 5,000. Again, sounds like a lot. If you saw them in one place, it would look impressive, but spread out across 48 states, not that many. Most of those are actually in private hands, not in zoos or circuses, as you might assume, but private owners. We even have in the U.S. now a burgeoning camel dairy industry. There are over 12 dairies spread out across the Midwest, the East, and a bit in the West, Colorado and California. We've got 12 or 13 dairies now. Camel prices, for those of you who are shopping around, you're looking at a young male, let's say 2.5-year-old like this, he's gentle, he's sweet, 5,000, 6,500. Females will always be double because they've got that magic biology, all right? And the guys who are working this dairy thing seem to have a scent. Every time there's a female camel born, they grab it, and they're charging or paying prices like 12, 15, 16,000 for these female camels. The milk output in a camel is not near what it is in, say, a Holstein or a Jersey or a Guernsey bovine cow, but there are specific breeds of camels who are bred for high milk output, just like there are cattle or goats or sheep who are bred for that. But here in the U.S., it's still very much kind of in baby steps right now, still training wheels. We can't import camels from any of the foreign countries where camels are native to. So if I go to Egypt, for example, I find a wonderful specimen of a camel, $1,200, I can't import it because of livestock laws and fear of disease. But Australia, which is an island, and their camel history paralleled ours, it's a very clean country as far as livestock diseases go. So my camels actually owe their genetics to Australian camels imported here. If you're scratching your head saying Australian camels, at the same time that we imported camels here in the 19th century, the Australian government did the same thing. It was actually private enterprise. And they imported camels out of nearby India. From India down to Australia, pretty easy sea voyage. And from 1840 to 1900, Australia imported 10,000 camels. By the turn of the century and early part of the 20th century, roads and mechanization started crossing the outback. And by the 1950s, those camels in Australia were simply turned loose. Now, this is a myth that gets applied to our own camel population out west in the 1800s. Oh, after the war, the camels were just released to fend for themselves. It didn't happen. Those military camels were government property, and they were auctioned off and sold. A gentleman in New Orleans, through auction, bought 66 of them, 25 in California to another gentleman. We know where they went. But in Australia, that's not the case. They were simply released, and those 10,000 plus camels bred. And today, Australia has the only feral camel population on the planet, numbering about 300,000. So in the outback, yes, that's an impressive number of camels. Our little 5,000 here is a cute number, all right? So Australia's got 300,000 feral camels. They do become an ecological concern in that they're eating vegetation There's not a lot of predators for them there. Australia is kind of a weird place ecologically. And those camels during times of drought will migrate toward outback towns, and they'll break into air conditioning units to find water. They become a nuisance. So the government for about 5 years managed that feral herd. Again, we're talking Australia, not the US. They managed that feral herd by culling, that is shooting 80,000 camels a year just to cap the birth rate, just to keep the increase from growing. The funding for that program ended about 3 years ago, and now what folks are starting to do is go out into the outback of Australia and round up camels and either sell them back to countries in the Middle East to diversify genetics, or they're using them for domestic meat consumption or dog food in Australia. So it's a resource that should go and should be exploited rather than just let them breed and breed and breed and become more problematic. All of that to say, my camels, our family's camels, and the majority of one-hump camels in the U.S. are all out of Australian stock, originally from India in the 1840s. There are 2 species of camel on the planet. There's the one-hump variety, and they exist from Morocco to India and every country in between. If you have a service member in your family who's been to Iraq or Afghanistan in the last 15 years, they have seen this camel, the one-hump camel. They're local breeds. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some have longer hair, just like the differences between a quarter horse and a thoroughbred, or a Paso Fino and a Clydesdale. There are different breed variations, but in general, the one-hump camel numbers about 15 million from Morocco to India. Now, when you cross the Himalayas into China, and you get in Xinjiang province in the west, Inner Mongolia province, and Mongolia proper, that is the home of the two-hump camel. They are 2 different species. It's not like when a mom and dad have a baby camel, they wonder if it'll have 1 hump or 2 when it's born. They know because they live in Mongolia, it's a 2-hump camel. That's what lives there. The 1-hump camel lives everywhere. Your Aunt Ethel rode one on her trip to the Holy Land. Okay? So these 2 different species of camels are completely different. They are no more similar than a lion is with a tiger, except they're both cats. These are both camels. The federal government in 1856 actually reported both kinds. They had about 65 one-hump camels and a dozen or so two-hump camels. Again, to bring it back to old Douglas, the one-hump camel, we don't really know his age, but we know that we first learned about him in Iuka, in Corinth, and here in Vicksburg, rather, over about a 10-month period in 1862 to 1863. So for those of you who live here in Corinth or this part of Mississippi, this is your history. This happened right here where you live. And if you don't remember the names or the dates or any of the more academic aspects of the story that I've told, the most important job I think I have is to teach you for the first time, or in some cases, remind you about the stories you already heard growing up here, where you live, that this is your